Good morning to all of you good citizens assembled here, and good afternoon to Barry Friedman, who should be appearing. Is Barry there? Hi, Barry. Great. Coming to us from his home office in New York. Thanks to Zoom technology and the good work of the League of Women Voters Events Committee and others, including our colleague Carolina Goodman from the League of Los Angeles. And many thanks, of course, to our eminent speakers today. Recent days have been filled with news of policing issues in California, including Stephon Clark's killing in Sacramento, reports on Pasadena resident J.R. Thomas's death settlement by the city, Los Angeles District Attorney report absolving officers involved in his death of criminal responsibility, and yesterday's introduction of legislation in Sacramento, I can't see, that would require police officers to de-escalate confrontation with suspects who appear, thank you, who appear to police to be armed and dangerous by calling for backup and warning the suspect prior to shooting, all of which would be a national first if it survives the opposition in the legislative process. And all of this as we ponder Martin Luther King's legacy and civil rights upon the 50th anniversary of his assassination yesterday. All this to say, it's very good to see so many of you here interested in informed policing policy reform by citizen engagement with the police. Yes. Oh, okay, thank you. As Dorothy said, we're very glad to see city leaders and members of our police department with us today. Our League's Social Justice Committee anticipates introducing at our June annual meeting a call to study constitutional policing. Let me call your attention quickly to a resource sheet on your tables or chairs on police reform and a request for support of Senator Nancy Skinner's bill introduced yesterday in Sacramento that calls for improving law enforcement transparency and accountability by honoring the public's right to know about how agencies handle deadly uses of force and proven serious misconduct by peace officers, which currently are shrouded from public view. This information is on the table. Well, this is on your table. I'd like also to say that while the League of Women Voters of California does not yet have a position on this particular bill, the League is traditionally supportive of government, of open government, and believes that a strong government is dependent on an informed public. Now to our speakers and the issue of civic engagement in police reform today. Barry, if you would be good enough to explain in 30 minutes what you mean by democratic constitutional policing reform and how it would work, that would be good. Then I'd like to ask Matt Johnson and Max Huntsman to each take 10 minutes to respond and comment on their experience with civic engagement in policing policy, and then we'll take questions from the audience and answers, hopefully too. A note before we start. On your table are cards on which we ask, if you have questions, that you print, please, clearly, succinctly, any questions you want to ask any of the speakers today. So let's start with Barry Friedman, a law professor at NYU, founder and director of its Policing Project, and author of the critically acclaimed book On the Crisis in American Policing and the long overdue need for civic engagement in making the policies, the rules that govern the police. Unwarranted is the name of the book, Policing Without Permission. We will have autographed copies of this book for sale afterwards out in the foyer. So, Barry, it's your turn.
Thank you, everyone. It's good to be here. I want to acknowledge the remarkable principles of physics that have allowed all of you to fit into my very small study here today. Sorry that the weather's gotten pretty chilly for all of you in Pasadena, but we'll get by. I want to thank Chris and Carolina and everybody at the League who've been incredibly energetic and persistent about making this happen. I've never appeared 3,000 miles away before by video, so we're going to see if we can make this work. One of the things that we're going to try to make work is I'm going to disappear in just a second, and I'm going to let the screen get taken over by my slides, so I won't be able to see what's happening, and if anything goes wrong, I hope somebody will shout at me. But here we go. How's that?
Good.
Good. So that's my book. We'll come back to that at the end. I've been told I'm not good enough at this, so we want everybody to buy the book. But let's turn to the issue in front of us now. So I know everybody in Pasadena has been very focused on the death of Reginald Thomas, and I've read a great deal about it. What I'm going to ask you to do for the moment is to forget about it and to focus on a broader picture. And the reason is not because it's not important, but part of the problem that we have around policing is that when we focus on incidents after they've happened, we very often are missing a great deal of the story. So I want to start instead with these folks. This is Charles and Etta Carter. I've traveled around now with them in my head for quite a long time, and I want to tell you a story about them. So Charles and Etta Carter were in their car heading north on I-95 through Maryland on a very, very hot July day when they were stopped by the Maryland Patrol. Charles and Etta have a daughter, Charlotta, who I've had the pleasure to speak with on many occasions. Incredibly proud of her. She's a PhD psychologist. And so when she got her PhD, got a new job in Florida, got married, got a new house, all of that at one time, they did what all proud parents do, which is that they loaded up their van with things that the couple would need, and they headed down to Florida and they helped set up shop. They stayed for a while, maybe in my experience longer than the bridegroom might have preferred. But nonetheless, at some point, they loaded back up their van with things that the newlyweds didn't need, and they headed back up to Maryland. And it was at that time that they were stopped. The officer that stopped them explained that Charles was driving in a, and I quote, wobbly fashion. Charles had never in his life had any traffic infraction. They took them out of the van, and they sat them up on an embankment in front of traffic on that hot day, and they proceeded to take the van apart. They took everything out of it. They tore up large bags of detergent, cereal, opened up wedding invitations, threw Charlotta's wedding dress out on the embankment, where if it had not been properly wrapped up, it would have been destroyed. The officers even sat on their folding chairs for a while they were resting during the search. They took apart a small refrigerator. And then at one point, they called in a drug dog. The drug dog ran everywhere that it needed to go to check things out. It urinated around the Carter's possessions, but that wasn't the half of it, because Etta Carter had a bladder problem, and they traveled with a porta potty. And on 3 occasions, Etta got up and asked to use the porta potty, and the officers refused to let her do that. And so finally, sitting out there on that hot July sun, Etta soiled herself. And when the officers were done, having found nothing, because there was nothing ever to find, they left, leaving the Carters to head off to a rest stop and for Etta to deal with her huge embarrassment. The Carters came back to Philadelphia. They spent several sleepless nights. They didn't know what to do. They eventually went to the AAA. The AAA led them to the ACLU of Maryland, and they sued and eventually recovered a judgment from the Maryland State Patrol. I want to talk about what happened to the Carters, but I also, because I'm a law professor, and so I hope you'll forgive me, want to start with a little test. So I'm going to tell you a number of stories, shorter stories than that one, and I want you to be thinking about the following question as I tell them. What do these stories have in common? Let's start here. That is Tamir Rice. So many of you know about the story of Tamir Rice. The Cleveland police got a call that there was a young man in a park with a gun. They rushed to the park. They rushed all the way up to Tamir Rice was. They hit the brakes and slid for a while. One of the officers jumped out, but they didn't know that it was a boy and that it was a toy gun, even though the dispatcher had been told that it wasn't related to the officers. And within seconds of getting out of the car, one of the officers had shot Tamir Rice. They had no first aid available in the police car, and so what they did was they hid behind the car until backup arrived, and by that time, Tamir Rice had died. So this is a very, very different element of law enforcement. This is a Stingray device. So I'm just curious, because I'm always curious about this, and you have to do this by voice. Who's heard of a Stingray? Few people. So Stingray devices are remarkable. What they're used is that they trick cell phones into thinking that they're a cell tower, and it allows the police to locate a cell phone that they need. It can be incredibly valuable. I mean, imagine a kidnapping, for example, and you've got to find where the person is, and you've got their cell phone number. You can use a Stingray to triangulate and find it. But the Stingrays have also been used, we know, around protests, including Black Lives protests, to track protesters and their movements. We don't know a lot about Stingrays, though we've learned a lot in the past year or so, because Stingrays were given to local law enforcement or purchased by local law enforcement with federal grants under contracts that didn't allow law enforcement to disclose anything about the existence of the technology, non-disclosure agreements with the FBI, including disclosing anything to government officials or courts, so that many courts who were quite indignant when they learned about that were misled about how it was that law enforcement officials were getting the information that the vet, who was living in an apartment complex in suburban Virginia. And because he was a vet, when he woke up in the morning with gun barrels in his face one morning, he understood exactly what was happening. He was a target of a raid, but he didn't understand why. Well, it turned out that he had trouble with his apartment, and his landlord had moved him into a temporary apartment. The neighbors got suspicious and wondered what was happening, and so they called the police. And the police responded with a SWAT raid, breaking down his doors and rushing into his bedroom early in the morning. When Horton figured out what had happened, he went to the police department the next day and asked, why did you do that? Why not conduct an investigation? Why not even call the apartment complex and ask what was going on? And he was told, this is how we investigate. You might wonder what's going on in this photograph. Well, if you think about it, driving under the influence is an enormous problem in this country. In fact, we talk a lot about threats to public safety, but one of the leading causes of death is traffic fatalities. When individuals are driving under the influence of alcohol, we have simple tests to discover that. But when they're driving under the influence of drugs, it's more complicated. What some law enforcement officials have begun to do, and they've begun to do this particularly in states kind of in the Middle West, I don't know why, is that they've taken people to be catheterized, including forcibly catheterized when people have refused, sometimes even without warrants. And finally, I'm just going to end by reminding you that in 2013, all of us learned, courtesy of Edward Snowden, that our telephone metadata, and in fact, some of our internet metadata, had been collected in bulk by the United States government. So the question is, what do all of these very, very different things have in common? People tend to focus on use of force, or they focus on stop and frisk, or they focus on policing technologies like stingrays or predictive policing or facial recognition. But few of the analyses of what's going on in policing in the United States today take the whole picture and ask, how do we fit all of this together? And that's where I think I'm a bit different. So the answer is found in the subtitle of my book, Policing Without Permission. And I want to talk to you about that today. So I want to do that by giving you a super simple civics lesson. You all actually know all of this, even though you don't always focus on it with regard to policing. So we've got 3 branches of government. And it's a cardinal rule of governance in the United States that the people's voice is what spells accountability. So when we make policy, when we make rules, when we pass laws, the voice of the people matters. And to be clear, we all understand that there's dysfunctions in government, and there are parts of government that we're familiar with that don't always represent exactly the voice of the people. But there's a basic pattern that we all know. And the pattern goes like this. The country is run by transparent rules to which we all have input. And we try as best we can to make sure that those rules do more good than they do harm. And that's what we mostly think of as accountability. Now, things go wrong. And when they go wrong, we have ways to deal with that as well. So we have judicial review, we have legislative hearings, but mostly accountability is on the front end, and then the back end is used when there's a problem. In policing, though, for reasons that are historical and odd, and I'd be happy to describe, but they're not very germane, we do this in reverse. When we talk about accountability in policing, and we talk about it all the time, we mean something very different. We mean accountability on the back end after things have gone wrong. When we talk about inspectors general and civilian review boards and court-appointed monitors, and even if you think about it, body cameras. They are all means of looking at something after it has happened and asking, is someone to blame? Has something gone wrong? And what I'd like to persuade you of today, and what the book is about, and what the policing project that I'll talk about in a moment does, is focuses on bringing front-end accountability to policing, to get citizens and police to collaborate together to make policy that everyone buys into. Now, to be clear, and I think it's important, there's a relationship between front-end accountability and back-end accountability. There's supposed to be. Front-end accountability makes rules. And once we have those rules in place, accountability works better. We hear a lot about how accountability doesn't work around policing, but it doesn't, as a lawyer who's done this for many years, surprise me at all, because it's difficult for back-end accountability to be effective or even fair if the front end isn't clear. On the other hand, when we have back-end accountability and it finds problems, it's supposed to let us know so we can fix things up front, which is exactly what Lisa Derderian was saying with regard to the Thomas case. Every use of force incident review provides an opportunity for the department to consider whether changes to policies, procedures, or tactics are warranted. That is exactly right, and that is the sort of thing in which the public should be involved. Why do we care? Because any time that policy is made, there's a set of questions that we ought to be asking that don't always get asked if the public isn't involved in the front end. One is there a need for what the police are doing? Do we need forced catheterization? Do we need bulk data collection of data? Do we need stingrays? Maybe yes, maybe no, but it's a question we ought to ask. We want to ask whether the thing even works. So one of the policing technologies that fascinates me is automatic license plate readers. They have their role, but they were originally adopted for something that has not proven to be very effective. And so it's very often the case with policing technologies that departments acquire technology and then find a use for it. That's the wrong way to do things. We want to ask, have we minimized the harm? It is simply a fact of policing that there will be coercion, that there will be surveillance of individuals. That is what policing is about. And we want that, but we want to minimize it. And so the question we should be asking is, do we have policies that minimize the harms while maximizing what we need, the public safety benefits? We ought to ask, have we limited police discretion? Police officers are some of the people that have the most discretion in society. Everybody recognizes that. That's part of the academic story and the real world story about policing. But part of what law does is minimizes discretion, gives people guidance about how to act. And finally, we just want to ask, do we need this done at all? Are we doing something that we think is appropriate in society? You know, I'll show my hand. It's going to be a pretty rare case indeed that I think forcibly catheterizing anybody can be justified. Now, the point I want to make next is that when we include the public in policy making up front, policy changes. Policing policy looks different, which is a clue that we ought to be thinking about this all the time. So I'm guessing most of you in the crowd can figure out where this is. This is Ferguson. Ferguson brought the country's attention to the militarization of police departments, the fact that we have programs in the country that provide military goods to police departments. Some of that equipment makes total sense. Some of it may not. But more importantly, that is a question that every community ought to be able to decide for itself. And not before Ferguson, but after Ferguson, many communities passed laws and ordinance to do just that. They all did different things, which is appropriate under our American system of government. Some kept the equipment, some sent it back, some set up procedures for public officials to know what equipment was being acquired, some had things to say about training, but the point was the public got involved and said, let's do this differently. Same thing with Tamir Rice. Now, following Tamir Rice, there was a Department of Justice investigation, and as a result of that investigation, there is a federal monitor. But as part of that monitorship, there's public engagement around things. We're working with the federal monitor there. Cleveland has a new use of force policy, had an old style use of force policy that did not give adequate guidance to officers. There's a new style policy in place now, vetted through the public. Same thing with bulk data collection. You know, is bulk data collection a good idea or a bad idea? That's a super complicated question. But what's essential is that now, after Edward Snowden, we all know about it, and there's a new set of rules in place about where the data rests and how the government gains access to it. Now, one of the points I always make, and we often make at the Policing Project, and we spend our days working very, very closely with policing agencies, is something that was made by the 21st Century Task Force, which is that law enforcement agencies themselves should care about transparency and accountability, that we've had a crisis of legitimacy and trust in too many communities, and that that can be remedied, and that in fact we can have better public safety if we all work together. So things like stop and frisk in my hometown, which had a devastating effect on the legitimacy of the NYPD. And I have to say, and we're happy with to work with our partners at the NYPD, that they have done remarkable, almost to my mind, mind-bending things about changing the nature of policing in this city. Here in an area closer to home for you, where the police acquired surveillance technology, aerial surveillance technology, and used it over the city until it was found out, and then that was the end of that program. When things like this happen, and we all ought to understand that we're living in a world in which there are not going to always be secrets that get kept, then in fact, it undercuts law enforcement. But there's a lesson here, one that's quite close to home, which is although that happened in Compton, in Lancaster, California, they acquired exactly the same technology. They had a public meeting about it. They decided to use it, and it remained in use after Compton's because of that public engagement. That's a drone. Similar thing happened with drones. Seattle acquired drones. The public found out. Folks went almost literally nuts. Seattle had to get rid of its drones and ship them to LA, where I'm given to understand they sat in an equipment closet for a long time. Lots of jurisdictions in California have drones and have policies in place to use them effectively because they went to the public in advance and they talked through what those policies should look like. In fact, we're working with the Tucson PD right now to develop a drone policy. That's the story. This is the title page for my book. The first part is about this idea of democratic policing. The second part is about constitutional policing, the rules that govern policing under the Constitution. And finally, 21st century policing, which has to do with surveillance technologies, data. The Supreme Court's got a big case this term about location tracking under the Constitution. But what I want to do for just a couple more minutes, and then I'll subside and I want to hear from everybody else, is to talk just 1 minute about the Policing Project, which is an organization that we founded here at NYU right between Edward Snowden and Ferguson to deal with these ideas of democratic policing, to find a way to engage the public and policing agencies together in collaborative policing and policing policy. So we work all over the country with policing agencies and with the public. In Nashville, for example, I've been in touch with the mayor's office there. We're working with the PD and the mayor's office. Nashville engages in a lot of traffic stops. The question is why and whether that's effective. We're doing the country's first cost-benefit analysis of that kind of aggressive traffic stopping or proactive traffic stopping, working with the community and the police to figure out whether it makes sense and whether there's a better idea to go about it. We're working in Chicago. We've helped draft an ordinance for a police commission, looking to our friends in LA, but also are working with the PD very closely in 2 districts in a pilot to bring neighborhood policing and community engagement around policing. And since I mentioned it, we've worked with the LA Police Commission on a question that they were faced with, that people are being faced with all over the country, which is, there's been this rush to body cameras. We could talk about it. I have a variety of things to say on this subject. But one of the hard questions is, when do you release the video after an officer-involved shooting? That was a question in LA. We worked closely with my friend Matt Johnson and the LA Police Commission and folks in LA to gather information on public views. And LA now has a new publicly formulated policy that frankly is a good model for much of the country. We work on transparency. We have something called the Manuals Initiative, where we're helping police departments get their manuals online. Some departments have them online, many don't. Not only is there a question of getting it online, but, and you have to understand that the challenges are vast, but a lot of police departments simply dump their big PDF online with no way to search it, no sort of clickable guide. So we're working with Camden as a pilot and also Tucson right now to put their manual online in a way that also has summaries of the key policies that people want to see, because policing policies themselves are a challenge, I think, even for police officers. So we're trying to write stuff in plain language. And finally, as I mentioned, we're doing cost-benefit analysis of policing practices all over the country. We're looking at de-escalation training. We're looking at pursuit policies. We're looking at ShotSpotter and other police technologies. We're looking at proactive police stops. That's it. There is our URL and our Twitter handle, and you can sign up on our URL to join our mailing list so you hear from us frequently.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next on our format is Matt Johnson, Vice President of LAPD's Police Commission, which oversees and makes policy for the department. Members of the commission are, yes, thanks, are appointed by the mayor. Matt is an attorney in private practice and has served on the commission since his appointment in 2015, I think, isn't it? He's experienced the NYU Policing Project, as Barry said, when it worked with the commission, LAPD, and several Los Angeles communities to devise a policy of when to release body camera videos to the public. And as you probably know, usually police departments keep such videos restricted from public view, usually in opposition to public desires to see them. But recently, as Barry said, the LAPD has announced a very successful change of having these critical incident videos be available to the public within 45 days, or in 45 days. So with no more ado, let me introduce and ask Matt Johnson to come.
Good morning. It's nice to see so many people here and engaged in this issue. In 2015, when I joined the Police Commission, there was a lot of engagement around this issue, and as these things tend to go, the public's attention has, and I've noticed, has turned to other matters, so it's good to see such a room full of engaged people. So, as was mentioned, I'm Vice President of the Police Commission for the Los Angeles Police Department. I joined the commission in 2015. I was appointed president at that time. I served for 2 years, and after 2 years, my term was up, and you have to rotate off for at least a year. The police commission in the city of Los Angeles is different than most police oversight agencies, whether it's police review boards or inspector generals. As Barry talked about, what you generally see is that back-end oversight. What is unique about LA is that we have both front-end and back-end oversight. And that you might think that's because we're incredibly enlightened in Los Angeles. That's not really the case. It's because a lot of the trauma that other cities are facing now and a lot of the issues that have come to light, LA has dealt with much earlier. So we had the Watts riots in the 60s. We had the riots related to Rodney King in the 90s. We had a federal consent decree that arose out of some criminal misconduct from our gang agency. So all of those things over time really strengthened the oversight of the LAPD. So there's five, we're all volunteers. There's 5 of us. We're appointed by the mayor. It is a part-time, no-paying job that is a full-time, no-paying job. I literally spend as much time on police commission business as I do my day job. And it's really because of this dual responsibility of the front end and the back end oversight. So let me talk a little bit about that front end oversight. And it's really important to have the responsibility of both. So, and one other thing, so the Sheriff's Department recently adopted a civilian oversight panel, but that is just advisory. They don't actually have the power to change policy. They can make recommendations, and the sheriff can, at the end of the day, accept or reject them. So, for example, the Sheriff's Department there, they adopted a drone policy. There was no sort of public engagement first. They just announced they were doing this policy. The commission actually came out and said, we don't like the policy, and the sheriff basically said, too bad, we're keeping our drones. What we did a much different, we had a much different process. We looked at the technology, and we believe, along with the sheriff, that it is a very valuable tool for law enforcement. But like any of these things, these tools have to be used appropriately. So what we did is we had public hearings about it. We engaged in a public input process. We then drafted, along with the department, a draft policy. We made that available to the public. We got more input on that. And we're in the process right now. We will have a one-year pilot program of running that, running the drones and seeing how they're used. And we have built in very strict oversight of when the drones can be used and who actually has the authority to authorize them, including anytime a drone has been authorized, there's 2 members of the police commission that are on the oversight. I'm one of the 2 that have to be immediately notified. So there's not this that accountability and transparency, and then is built into the policy, and then that's all publicly reported. So when we look at how we can influence the police department, the commission is responsible for all policy of the department. We're the final say. The commission can set all policy, so that can be anything from the video release policy, which I worked with Barry on, to drones, to the use of force policy, et cetera. The chief of police is responsible for the daily operations of the department. Ultimately, he reports up to the police commission, so it's like any other board of directors. On the back-end oversight side, we are responsible for reviewing all serious use of force cases. So that's any officer-involved shooting, any time a use of force is used where the individual ends up being required to be hospitalized, a death in police custody. The commission reviews those cases and ultimately makes a determination of whether or not the officer acted in policy or out of policy. Once we make that determination, it goes back to the chief, and the chief decides the level of appropriate discipline. On the front end side, our approach has been really to look at 3 areas: policy, training, and equipment. And the 3 really have to work together. You can change policy, but if you don't have the training to back it up, you're not ultimately going to change behavior or culture. And if you don't properly equip the officers, you're also going to limit the amount of impact that you can have. So for example, one of the first things that we did when I joined the police commission was we changed the use of force policy. And Barry, you actually mentioned, or someone mentioned that in California, it's actually on the table, the draft legislation around change. Is that the draft legislation around, I think, changing the use of force policy to require de-escalation? Well, we actually did that. We changed our use of force policy to make the using of force more restrictive, to require de-escalation when it's safe for the officers to do so. And it's one thing to actually have that be a policy, but then what we also did was we have built in much more intensive training around de-escalation. So all of our officers now have very specific de-escalation training. It's built into the academy, and then every officer that's on the force has to go through de-escalation training, so they have the skill set to actually make it meaningful. We've also equipped our officers differently. So when I joined the police commission, whether an officer had a taser or not was optional. It was their choice whether to use them or not. And then if they did choose to use them, we did not have enough holsters for everyone. So we made sure that not only was it required that they have a taser, but that they would actually have a holster so they could carry them all the time, and they're required to carry them. It seems common sense, but these things, the tasers have been around for a long time. And I know in some jurisdictions they don't think they're useful, but I can tell you, being on the ground and having that back-end oversight, and you see case after case, and you're like, God, if they only had a taser, if they only had a beanbag shotgun, they would not have had to use deadly force. So one of the things that we were recognizing was that there were a number of officer-involved shootings that people were involved with either knives or other objects that were not firearms. And tasers are a very effective tool, but they don't always work, and you have to be in a relative close proximity to someone. So using a taser on someone with a knife could be unreasonably dangerous for an officer, but it's a perfect situation to use a beanbag shotgun. So now we have all of our squad cars are equipped with beanbag shotguns. So, we were very quick after the Hollywood shooting incident, which was tragic for our department. It was a miracle that there was not a greater loss of life, that all of our police cars were equipped with rifle holsters for AR-15 type weapons, but we did not have those beanbag platforms in the car. Now we do, and that was a change that came about by the police commission. And the truth of the matter is, our officers don't use their rifles that much. They use the beanbag shotguns quite frequently, and they're very effective. So it's that combination. It's really those are just examples, but it's that combination of policy, training, and equipment to sort of start moving you to get to the results that you want to get to. And some of the other policy changes, working with Barry on the, and a lot of these things, work well together. So my predecessor, Steve Sobroff, as president, he really led the initiative to have us equipped with body cameras, which I can tell you from a back-end oversight perspective, there is nothing more helpful than having body camera footage. I mean, it's a night and day difference. And right now, all of our officers are equipped with body cameras. Many instances, we have the digital in-car video also, and it just makes it's a total different situation when we're adjudicating these cases, when we can see the footage. Obviously, the public wants to see that footage. When I joined the commission, it was one of the things that I deeply wanted to change. Our policy was we never release footage. And I was told that it was going to be too politically difficult to do, that the police union would never get on board with it. So we took a long time to do it, but I wanted to have the buy-in from the police union as well, because you can win the battle but lose the war. I mean, you do not want to alienate your police officers to the point that they stop doing their jobs. And that was very important to me to do it right. So we spent a lot of time, and Barry and the Policing Project from NYU was very helpful in that, in helping people understand that actually increasing transparency helps to build trust. And really getting the officers to understand that the public does not expect perfection. They expect that officers are going to make mistakes. They expect that officers are going to even sometimes do bad things. But what they do expect is when that does happen is that there's accountability and that people are being held accountable. And so as long as, we had a horrific shooting in Venice, where a homeless man was shot by an LAPD officer. And the reason why that situation did not escalate was because the chief of police he immediately said, I have real problems with this shooting. So immediately the public's now back on their heels. They're like, oh, okay. Well, they're saying that they think there are issues. And he came out and said, I think he should be prosecuted. Obviously, that officer ended up being fired. Now, unfortunately, chief of police felt that officer should have been prosecuted. I personally felt that officer should have been prosecuted. I've said so publicly many times, and our district attorney felt otherwise and didn't. But that anger is not directed at the police department. That anger is directed at the district attorney. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can, and as it should be. I hope we have some time for some Q&A later.
We will.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next is Max Huntsman, LA Sheriff's Department Inspector General. The mission of the Office of Inspector General is to provide independent and effective oversight of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and to ensure transparent, accountable, and constitutional policing for the County of Los Angeles. Max worked for the DA's office for over 20 years, several in a division that analyzes police misconduct allegation and uses of force. Without further ado, Max Huntsman.
Hello, everybody. I think this is a wonderful panel because you've gotten three very different perspectives on the exact same point. And I believe everybody is in agreement on what Professor Friedman talks about as front-end accountability. I'm not sure I would use the word accountability in that context, but the idea that you need to address problems on the front end if you want to have community involvement in policing and, I believe, also effective policing. But we all have different ways of approaching it. We have an academic perspective. We have the perspective of a civilian commission which is, as you heard at LAPD, both a back-end and a front-end process. And in the Sheriff's Department at the county level, we also have a commission and an inspector general, as they do, but it is also both a back-end and a front-end process. It's much less back-end because, as you heard, we're advisory. The commission that we have is advisory, and so is the inspector general. I have no power whatsoever. In fact, that was pointed out to me by an interim sheriff a while back with a kind of a red face at the time that he was asking, what power do you think you have? And I have no power, zero, nothing up my sleeves, right? Except that I get to see everything and I get to tell the public what happened and the public's institutions. And on a number of occasions, that's resulted in amazing shifts in the Sheriff's Department. Don't get me wrong, we got a lot more amazing shifts we need. But it's had an incredible impact. And ironically, many of the things that Commissioner Johnson was telling you about that have gone through the muscular LAPD process of a commission with the ability to set policy are very similar to the things that have happened in the Sheriff's Department through a different process. In fact, of all the things he was talking about, the only one that at all, to my ear, sounds a little different is the approach regarding beanbag shotguns. And the Sheriff's Department is actually pushing out more of a larger weapon that is like a beanbag shotgun but bounces a bigger beanbag, a plastic baton. And I'm a big proponent of it because beanbag shotguns, like tasers, are hit and miss, and not just literally, but also in terms of the effectiveness. But the Arwen, a more intense weapon, knocks people down and they stay down often. They sometimes get a broken rib as a result. And so it's not a weapon to be used because a person is unruly, but it is a weapon to be used in lieu of shooting them because they will survive it as opposed to a bullet, which will often kill you. So that process of analyzing is very similar under all these different formats, and I think it goes back to the key thing the professor said, which is civilian involvement. If you leave a police department to its own devices, I'm going to pull up my phone because I made a couple notes about what was said, to its own devices, it tends to be insular, and it tends to make its own expertise-based decisions about how to do things. Not from a place of militaristic control necessarily, but from a place like a doctor would. Doctors would generally prefer not to hear our opinions about how to fix us because we're annoying. We don't like the pain, we don't like this, we don't want that. They would rather just show up, do the thing, and there we're done. But that's not how it works, right? It can't work that way. You have to work with your patient, and the police have an expertise that they need to bring to bear, but they need to do it in the context of hearing from the public what the public wants, not just at election time, but all the time. And so that's what our commission is designed to have happen. And it's off to a bumpy start, but I think it's moving in the correct direction. The example was given of the drone case, and the policies of LAPD and LASD are very similar at the end of a process that worked differently. The sheriff, I think, has to get used to the process of interacting with the public through a commission more because it hasn't been the practice in the past. And so that's a learning process for both parties, but I think we are moving in that direction. And on body cameras, the sheriff actually sent a letter to this commission inviting them to weigh in. And there was a panel at Loyola yesterday, Loyola Law School, run by one of those commissioners on that issue. By the way, I do disagree with the professor about the rush to body cameras. At that panel, Professor Miller of Loyola mentioned that they came into widespread use in 2010 as a technology that was employed by police, not everywhere, but in large segments of particular police forces in an effective way, and now it's 8 years later. So I don't think we're rushing, and along that same line, LAPD is now employing dash cams as a result of consent decrees. They even with commissions present, they had to be pushed through external forces. So there's no magic bullet to get law enforcement to move. The Sheriff's Department, on the other hand, was told in 1992 by the Colts Commission, if you have a problem with shooting people and then getting big judgments against you, and maybe that's a problem, you should look into dash cams. Does anybody know how many dash cams are deployed in the Sheriff's Department today, 25 years later? Nobody knows? Come on, guess. 0. That's right, 0. So I don't think we're rushing. But, I wasn't employed then, darn it, and now it's going to be different. And that's why I say to you, it's important to look at different solutions to the same problem. You've got commissions, which are critical. You've got academics, which are critical. But inspectors general, when handled properly, are a more executive office kind of solution, which is you get a bunch of experts in, you toss them in there inside, and get them to look around and come up with solutions, both internally, where they can have conversations with the department to encourage them to work harder, and then also externally by reporting information out to the public so that the public can then engage. I was always amazed a couple of years back by a video that went public regarding cell extractions for mentally ill inmates in prison. It was the subject of a lawsuit, and the public was outraged at the way in which these people were extracted from cells. It's how it's done every single day in prisons all across the country, and to this day is how it's done. And it was outrageous to the public because they had no idea. No idea. You want to talk about lack of transparency? Custody facilities is where there's a larger lack of transparency, in large part because of our turning a blind eye. Some of this you can blame on the police department, but some of this has to do with us. As Commissioner Johnson mentioned, the public spotlight is not always on us, and we in this business appreciate it when it is because it helps us do our job. The spy plane over Compton, by the way, I'll disagree with the professor on that one too. The spy plane didn't stop because the public found out about it. It stopped before the public found out about it, and it stopped because the resolution of the photographs wasn't good enough. Yeah, not because of public outrage, because of the technology. And that's an important lesson because in all these technological changes that we have in our world, we have to pay close attention to how we roll them out and to community involvement in the process so that we get buy-in from the public, as was discussed with the drones. It's not just a question of arbitrarily deciding, arbitrary is the wrong word, technically deciding whether or not they are useful, because they are. In a hostage situation, in a rescue situation, there are times when they're absolutely critical. But to do apples to oranges, the benefit in a tactical situation versus the risk of creeping surveillance and the fear that people have that drones are going to be following them around, those you have to balance through community discussion. You can't just decide that the one outweighs the other. You really have to walk the walk to get there. And then you have to, as was discussed, continue to monitor to make sure you got what you paid for. And then the last thing I'll disagree with the professor on, again, I agree with almost everything he said and his conclusions, is the idea that the police are unique in the absence of transparency. I think that's hogwash. I used to work in the district attorney's office prosecuting public officials in governments, and I did it. I had no shortage of work, let me assure you. Yes, public officials, such as those we have who are elected, there's a great deal of that front-end interaction. But governments are composed not just of the few people we have here, they're vast bureaucracies, the federal government, the state government, the county government, and those bureaucracies are very difficult to penetrate in an accountable front-end way. And in the county of Los Angeles, I can speak to, we have a problem that all the managers of the county know, which is that it's hard to keep that spotlight shining everywhere. And when you move it away from a place, problems develop, and then you end up with back-end accountability. Hearing that we have a problem, we had a problem with our child welfare system a while back where a child died as a result, and there's a criminal prosecutions, and then, oh, we're jumping in and trying to fix it. And we're always behind the 8 ball in that because bureaucracy loves darkness. It loves to work in secret because we, the experts, know better than you, the public. And if you are bothering us with questions, it makes it difficult to do our job. If I go back to my office and you all call me on the phone and tell me what you think, you're going to drive me nuts because I know what I'm doing. So we don't like transparency, but we have to be forced to accept it in order for the system to function, and policing is like other government processes in that.
Okay, thank you. Now to question and answer. And I'd like each of you to sit here. And what happened to the microphone? Oh, there it is. Good. Okay, if you'll share the microphone, and Barry, you're on the wall again. So I'm taking questions. And I think the first question that I'll ask, and let me ask it of, well, what?
Good? Can you hear me?
It's working?
Not working or is working?
Not working. Okay, raise your hands in the back of the room if you can't hear.
Can you hear me when
Okay.
I'm talking now? Because I'm talking quietly. If I use my big voice, you can hear me, but not if I'm talking like.
There you go. There you go. Okay. All right. Let's go forward. Okay. Our first question is, and I'll let you all decide who wants to answer it, of course. Currently, the Pasadena Police Department has a de facto policy of stop and frisk implemented by its, quote, special enforcement unit, close quote. What are your thoughts on the efficacy and constitutionality of policies like this?
I'm not a fan of stop and frisk as a policy. I think if you look at, there's been a number of studies done on particularly the use of stop and frisk in New York, where vast numbers of people were stopped. It is almost always the case that that it's poor people of color that end up getting stopped in vast numbers. The number of the percentage of criminal activity that ends up being exposed through it does not at all justify the vast number of people that are getting stopped. What it does to the relationship between the police department and the communities that they are there to serve in the first place, it's devastating. It totally erodes trust, and you go from being guardians to being an occupying force. So personally, I think it is a wrong-headed policy, and I also believe it to be unconstitutional.
Yeah, so I just echo what Matt said. And so two things. First, I don't even know what it means to say that somebody has a stop and frisk policy. I mean, the Supreme Court doctrine about stop and frisk says that there has to be reasonable suspicion. And if police see reasonable suspicion of unlawful activity, then they can intercede and try to do something about it. It's nonetheless true that jurisdictions have adopted policies of aggressive, often called proactive traffic stopping or pedestrian stopping. And the data on this, as Matt says, is incredibly thin. The studies, are relatively inconclusive. The costs are huge. One of the things we do when we study policing is that we almost never try to monetize the social costs, which is, what is the impact on community trust? What is the impact on individuals who think they've been racially profiled? And that's exactly what we're doing in Nashville now for, I think, the first time on this scale, which is really, we've got a team of social scientists from around the country trying to figure out, and traffic stops are interesting because the people who get stopped often have done something in violation of the traffic law, because we're all violating the traffic laws all the time. But the question is, does that make any sense as a crime enforcement strategy? And we're going to try to get some answers, but I want to underscore Matt's point, which is by and large, these policies end up being unconstitutional and imposing great costs on folks.
How is de-escalation behavior recognized and rewarded in police career trajectory? Training is good, but actual behavior needs to be positively reinforced for real changes to happen.
So that's a great question. I think police departments generally are very good at rewarding crime-stopping behavior. So you get a gun, you make a good arrest, you get a check mark. You get a gun off the street, you get a check mark. All of those types of behaviors, we are very good at rewarding. But the positive behaviors, whether it's exhibiting de-escalation skills, whether it's doing some type of community engagement activity, we're not as good at recognizing. So it's actually something right now at the LAPD that we have a group of people, a mix of civilians, day-to-day patrol officers, command staff, working on creating some metrics so that we can recognize that behavior and reward it. We want to have those metrics. Has anybody here familiar with the phrase CompStat? So CompStat is on a relatively regular basis. We have CompStat meetings every week. We break it up by division every week. The people that run particular divisions of the city, so we have a lot of divisions. The city, LA is a big city. They come in, and you have the command staff there, and the people that run the divisions are grilled on everything that's happening in their division. But it's all based on crime statistics and where those are headed. We're building into CompStat these positive engagements also, so that the people that are ultimately running these divisions, they're essentially chiefs of what would be large cities in the rest of the country. They know that they're being measured on not only how many assaults there were, how many thefts there were, how many murders there were. They're also being measured on the positive community engagement, including things like de-escalation. And one of the things that Chief Beck did 2 years ago was he created a Preservation of Life Award at the highest level of the awards that we give out. So we've always been good at rewarding behavior where someone has done something heroic, they've put their life on the line to save someone. This is where they actually didn't do something like that, where they could have used deadly force, but they actually didn't, and they resolved the situation other way. Frankly, it's one of these things that's been somewhat controversial in policing circles, but I think it sends the right message to our rank and file.
I would echo the same thing, and I think the being that the way you reward it is in part by tracking it, by making sure it's kept track of, and the CompStat point is an important one. The stats in policing have tended to move from what CompStat was initially solely driven, and now it includes uses of force and other negative statistics. But the de-escalation is a difficult one to quantify and to keep track of on the street. But in the sheriff's department, in their custody facilities, because the sheriff does a lot of things, and one of the things they do is they're the jailer for the county and now for parts of the state because of legislative changes. We have cameras in the jails at a much more larger incident than we used to, and we do track de-escalation. And the internal processes of the sheriff's department have an internal auditing function that did an analysis of that and found flaws within the sheriff's department's operations in terms of how they were tracking the de-escalation, how they were reporting it, all to improve that process. And so internally, I think they're getting much better at tracking on the custody side de-escalation, and then therefore as a result it's going to work its way into your performance evaluation, into your analysis. On the patrol side, I pursue this through sort of a substitute means, which is we have a big movement these days towards dealing with mental illness, along with our movement towards dealing with homelessness. And there's a ramped up level of training in the Sheriff's Department and LAPD and many other agencies for the ability to intervene in a crisis with a person who's mentally ill in a different manner than you do with somebody who's simply a criminal, because they respond to different cues and there's different techniques for de-escalating. And that training, although it's focused on mental illness, I think produces deputies and officers who are more skilled at de-escalation. The focus of the department on it makes that more important to the department, and so therefore you will be rewarded if you do what's important to your bosses. And then finally, they have a program, LAPD has a version of this, and we have a version of this, of special teams that go out for mental illness with a law enforcement officer and a mental health professional, and they're designed to roll out. Now, they're in their infancy, and at the sheriff's departments, at least, that we don't have enough of them, so that they're not used as a de-escalation tool very often. They're used as a diversion tool, which is wonderful. But our Civilian Oversight Commission has been looking at recommending a much larger number of them so that we will have them showing up at the scene more often, so that they can either directly interface with people or assist the deputies who have to interface, because sometimes the mentally ill people are armed and a mental health professional is not going to stroll up to them. A lot of advocates say, well, we don't want the police involved, we want mental health professionals to show up. I'm afraid, again, back to bureaucracy, government employee, if I were a mental health professional and you said, go talk to that man with a gun and convince him not to shoot you, I would say, I'm unionizing right now. I'm done. And that's just a reality. So you have to employ law enforcement. But the flip side of it, the benefit is you now have people going on a career track in law enforcement whose whole job is de-escalation. And so that, yeah, of course they're going to get rewarded for that skill, and that's going to be their promotion track, and it's going to have a very positive impact on the overall de-escalation abilities of the department in general.
I'm good on this one. I want to make sure at some point we come back to body cameras, because even though Matt, Max, and I agree on 97.6% of everything, I do want to chat at the moment about body cameras.
Well, do it now. Go.
Yeah.
Take your best shot. Come on.
It's hard adjusting which way your head goes with the reversal. I seem to be leaning into the punches. So you know, Max, I'm sorry, pointed to 3 things that I had wrong, and on one about Compton, I'll defer. But on the other 2, I want to circle back, because I actually think there is a bad thing happening, and none of us are focused on it, or not. Far too few people are focused on it, which is, Max is 100% right about transparency in government generally. But the transparency I'm talking about is policy transparency up in front. And when it comes to policy transparency, the police actually are not completely unique, because prosecutors aren't so good either. But there is a policy transparency problem, and it's huge around body cameras. And it is because we have rushed into a technology without always thinking about the rules up front. And the risk is that even though we've moved to body cameras as a means of ensuring accountability, that what we are going to get is the largest surveillance mechanism that we've ever had in this country. Because if what you're doing is equipping police officers with cameras looking not at the police but at the public constantly, and you don't have adequate rules to govern how and when that footage is acquired and released, which is what Matt has done so ably and the police commission has done so ably in LA, then you're going to have a perversion of this thing that you spent an enormous amount of money on. So one of the issues that I've read about in the paper a great deal and care a lot about is biometrics on body cameras. There's now movement without public vetting to put facial recognition devices on body cameras and to build, again without public vetting, facial recognition databases. And I'm actually going to serve, it's an interesting thing, one of the largest vendor of body cameras, Axon, is creating an ethics board to think about how these technologies ought to work. And so, though I agree with, I think, Matt and Max, that it's important to have these accountability measures in place and that the cameras can do a great deal of good, we as a society have to think about what exactly those cameras are going to be doing and what it is we're going to use with that footage.
Okay.
I actually completely agree. And, that's kind of why I brought up the spy plane point, is that it was the technology that drove the decision, not the public outcry. And so I think it is important in body cameras that we have that discussion, because as technology marches forward, there are changes, there are genies that we won't be able to put back in the bottle. Having said that, I still think it's an easy call, as Matt had said, that body cameras are a good idea for a variety of reasons. And the most fundamental one is back to the point of drones, the difference between protecting against a bullet going into a body versus privacy. And I always go on the side of stopping the bullets over the privacy interests. But that's not to say that the privacy interests aren't important. And as I said, that's an apples to oranges comparison. So you can't count on your experts in government to just figure out which is correct and do it. You need to have, as the professor is saying, that public interaction, both up front, so that the public weighs in and says, are we good with it? And then on the back, processes such as the ethics board for Axon, and it's an excellent point that many of your rights are being taken away from you not by government but by corporations, and so you got to pay attention to that too. And then when corporations and government team up, then you have to be extra careful. But you can build in processes to address that as best as you're ever going to be. And 100 years from now, I'm pretty sure my descendants will have a lot less privacy than I have because of technology. So I don't mean to minimize that, but it's a tool we need to save lives, I think.
Yeah, if I can just weigh in, and I don't know if there's a lot of disagreement with us on these points, but I think the reality is policy is never going to keep up with technology. That's just a fact. Look at what's happening with Facebook right now, right? All of this is being disclosed about who has access to people's information and how they're using it, and now you'll see policies catch up with it. But there is such a tremendous benefit to using these technologies for the public's benefit, and then it's important to have that accountability and transparency, and that's why it's important to have, people like you, Barry, and looking at it from an academic perspective, and folks like the ACLU looking at it from their perspective, and then frankly, when you have a function in place like we do in Los Angeles with the police commission that has actual power and actual resources. Another difference that I didn't mention earlier is we have 60 full-time employees, including Inspector General, that has very similar powers or pretty much exactly the same powers as Max has. So it's that you want to use these technologies, you want to embrace these technologies, but like anything, just like an officer having a gun, we want them to have their gun, but if you don't have the right policies around it, there's a lot of opportunity for abuse, and it's no difference between a drone or a cell phone camera or anything else.
Okay, next question. Please talk about the challenges of both police unions and the Police Officers' Bill of Rights in holding police officers and departments accountable to the public for their wrongdoings.
Barry, you start with this?
That's a California one, so I'll let Barry off the hook. And it's also an incredibly complex and detailed conversation that I cannot address in 2 minutes, so I'm not going to do that. I will just say the Peace Officer Bill of Rights casts a cloak of secrecy over certain aspects of law enforcement and moves in the direction away from transparency. It was created for some very important reasons having to do with a set of court opinions and decisions about the process of making sure that defendants, criminal defendants, have access to information about what an officer has done wrong in the past. And it was meant to strengthen the non-transparent court process that protects individual rights. And that's a very important thing to protect. And if we had not done that, we might find ourselves in a world in which the police resisted disciplining themselves because they didn't want to get in the way of their mission of catching criminals. And that would truly be a horrific world. Now, I think we always have pressures in that direction anyway, and so we have to be careful of it. So it's a very different solution. But I will say, we currently have before the California Supreme Court a case involving what's called a Brady list, a list of misconduct by officers. And it all comes from the constitutional right of a criminal defendant in order to know if there's evidence that suggests they're not guilty. And that includes when witnesses have histories of dishonesty or what have you. And the sheriff decided to submit that list of officers who he had concluded had done something they shouldn't do. Even though under the law he's not allowed to tell the public, he thought that he had a constitutional obligation to tell the DA. And at one point, the DA was of the opinion that they didn't want such lists from law enforcement agencies. And I believe now their policy is, well, if you send it to us, we'll take it. Well, I'm not sure they said they'd look at it. They said they'd take it. To be fair, the DA's office started this ball rolling many years ago. Steve Cooley, when he was the DA, started a process of creating an internal Brady data bank out of the information that comes across prosecutors' desks on a regular basis, and to computerize it. And I personally believe that started a process that will inevitably lead to exactly what's being decided before the California Supreme Court now being approved, because it is unconscionable to me to think that a prosecutor shouldn't have all the information about whether or not a case is appropriately prosecuted against an individual because of that constitutional right of the individual, even if some of that information is contained in a file that a state law, not the Constitution, says has to be kept secret. See the difference? I don't know if we got any lawyers here, but if you were a lawyer, you'd know that the Constitution, laws, Constitution, laws, right? That's a lawyer thing, but some people have heard about that. I think that's an easy win, and I think in the long run, we're going to see an opening up of that, despite what the statute says. Doesn't mean you're going to read about the disciplinary history of an officer the next day in the paper when something happens. And I don't know how that'll go.
So These are tough issues, and I think the best way to address them is by making everybody uncomfortable. So let me do that. So, I'll start because the unions and the police unions are easy, whipping posts for the debates we're having about policing right now. But people often don't stop and think about this, from the perspective of police officers, and it's useful. So the police play kind of a remarkable role if you stop and think about it, which is that they are some of the only officials in society who are actually told to do something as a matter of their personal job responsibility that would be a criminal act for all the rest of us. So they make decisions as they move through their day to use force in ways that for the rest of us would be an assault, a criminal assault, name it. And they need a certain degree of protection to make sure that they can do that job in an effective way and not always be looking over their shoulder. On the other hand, I do think that fraternal organizations and some of the positions that they have undertaken have been an enormous obstacle to reform. But the answer to that is not to write off the fraternal organizations. The answer is to embrace them and figure out how we can all, as Matt did in LA, work together to get to sane policy places. And to do that, we all have to take a little bit of the hit, which is that, law enforcement Bill of Rights vary throughout the country. They have different sorts of provisions. Some of them are understandable. Some of them are entirely mystifying. But what's certainly the case is that public officials, acting with budget constraints in the name of all of us, are happy to trade away giving salary to police officers very often in exchange for all kinds of provisions that seemed cheap, but in the long run, have concerned people. And so what we need to do is have a meaningful societal conversation that involves the police, that involves the public, involves public officials to figure out what are the rights and responsibilities of police officers.
I really don't have anything to add other than I agree with both of you, and certainly on the police officer Bill of Rights. And dealing with unions from the commission standpoint, although we have the power to unilaterally set policy, we don't have to talk to anybody. But if that's the way you're going to go about doing your job, you are destined for failure. So the last 2 nights, I was at community meetings in different parts of the city of LA, talking to community members and getting their input and getting their buy-in and stuff that we were doing. This morning, I had breakfast with 2 delegates from the Police Protective League from the city of Los Angeles. And there's been instances where I've been able to work with them and get to a result that we could all live with, even though either they didn't like it. If it was up to them, we would not be releasing video policy. Period. Full stop. Video footage. They have no interest in it. But we got them to a place that they were comfortable with it, and the rollout of that in the department now is much more successful. On the other hand, when we changed the use of force policy, I could not get them on board, and for about a year, I was eviscerated by them every month in their monthly magazine, the Blue Line magazine, including, we can laugh about it, but they literally came to one of our police commission meetings and said I would have police officer blood on my hands because of passing this policy and not inviting me to police officer funerals. So this is serious when you're dealing with people that have guns all the time that you're around. So they have a job to do, right? They're union members, they're union leaders representing their officers, and they have to sometimes take positions that they even know, they have to get elected and they have to speak to their base. But it's important to work with all of these different organizations to get to good results.
Okay. Next question. Regarding training, what are your views on creating training programs for both police officers and community members to learn together?
So training is absolutely essential. For police officers, it is really a lifelong process. So we have a very robust academy, as does the Sheriff's Department. We are constantly looking at how we're training our officers, whether it's on de-escalation, whether it's on dealing with people that are mentally ill, whether it's dealing with people that are on drugs. Those folks, mentally ill, people that are on drugs, and now more and more our homeless community are responsible for almost a very, very, very high percentage of the use of force that you see officers involved in. So that training is critical. it would be great if we could train members of the public on a broad scale. It's much easier to train 10,000 officers, which let me tell you is not easy. But we try to educate the public as much as possible. So we do training days where we bring in civilians. We have these things called use of force. Use of force simulators, where we run people. You have essentially a fake gun, and you run through a scenario, and you have to give commands, and depending on what commands you give, the situation unfolds and whether you use deadly force or not. And we do those as much as possible. Our officers, our police commissioners, we're constantly out in the public, engaging with the public, engaging with community members and different organizations to try and educate them about the job and find out how we can work better together.
I agree with all that, and I would just add that the answer depends on what you're trying to train. So for the mental illness, in our training at the Sheriff's Department, mentally ill people are actually involved in the training and talking to the deputies about how they look at the world, the things that they perceive, as well as experts on talking about it. So that's a very positive interaction. On implicit bias training, which has started to pick up in government, I think we do a much poorer job, and I don't think we have enough community involvement in that, and I think it would benefit, again, through that interaction, because one of the lessons of implicit bias is interaction helps with it to some degree. Doesn't make it go away, but it helps. And so I think that's a way in which it could be very helpful. But I would echo what Commissioner Johnson says about, yeah, we'd all like to train the community. In fact, law enforcement, more than anybody, the first thing they say is, hey, we're trying to do better, but tell them, It's like, but when you got millions of people, you can't effectively do that. Society can do that, and individual police stations can do that in a community policing way to some degree. But at the end of the day, ultimately, we, the public, are kind of a larger beast that is left to its own devices, and it's not easy to kind of change how we look at the world, because the person the police are going to come into contact is the guy who didn't go to the training or wasn't listening some days. And so you just can't you have to get your police to be prepared to deal with a person who isn't going to do all the right things. We talk about police violence, we hear about it, we don't always talk about all the many, many contacts in which violence doesn't happen, either because the police act heroically or cleverly, or the citizen does likewise. I mean, there's lots of happy stories out there too, but it's the unhappy situations that we're trying to build a buffer against.
Barry, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Though by training and occupation, I would be happy to speak to everything at any length whatsoever. I agree with you. You can go to the next question.
Okay. Two UCLA law professors recently have completed the first study of Lexipol, the standardized law enforcement policies bought and used by the great majority of police departments in the United States, including Pasadena. The law profs noted a problem with these Lexipol policies that currently govern policing, and that is that the policies were clearly designed to protect the cities from potential liability. Two questions. Is this an issue that needs citizens' attention, and if so, how should they address it? And how is your policing project different and accessible to local departments and the public?
So, it was an interesting article, and I actually have the Lexipol website open on my browser, not because that question was going to be asked, but because it's on my to-do list to get in touch with Lexipol. So you certainly can't fault governments for having policies in place to avoid liability. I mean, I've been a lawyer for many years, and that would be my legal advice, to have policies that would avoid liability. The question is whether the policies are, tilt in one direction or another. And the response to that is to get people engaged. I mean, just because Lexipol helps think about this. We do draft policies for police departments. We're working on a host of policies around policing technologies, things like facial recognition, drones, body cameras. It's incredibly laborious to develop those policies. And at some level, it would be simply nuts to think that every one of the 18,000 police departments in the United States could or should write its own policies. So we need an efficient way to have a base of effective policies. The question is what you then do with those policies. Now, most of the public don't care about most of the policing policies, nor should they. And so what we've tried to do is look at police manuals and standard operating procedures and say, what are the 30 procedures or 40 procedures that the public should care about and would care about, and identify those, develop them in a way that the public can interact with them and get public input. And we actually would love to connect with Lexipol and partner on some of that because, again, my view is these vendors can be a problem. I mean, that's what, part of the point that Max was making, but they can also be an ally because they're going to have a lot of reach into police departments. And I want to make another point that may not always be as obvious in jurisdictions that are as large as Los Angeles, which is if you look at the 18,000 police departments in the United States, the median size of departments is something like 50 or 20. I mean, it's tiny. And so they're not going to have the capacity to develop all these policies and to make all of these decisions on their own. And it's hard to fault them for that. They've got a job in terms of keeping track of public safety. And so what we have to do are develop effective ways to make it easy for the police to do the right thing or the thing that the public would want.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I'd point out that, Pasadena is a pretty small police department compared to LAPD and LASD, and they don't have a 60-staff oversight process or a 24 staff as we do. They've got to do what they've got to do, and there are agencies that are even smaller, that are 6 guys. They cannot write their own policies and then keep them up to date. You know who could? The Attorney General of the state of California could. They could do it. They could do exactly what Lexipol does, and they could have a set of proposed, not required, policies for all police agencies in California to follow if they chose to, and they could get public input and academic input, and they haven't done it. The legislature could pass an order that they do that. The governor could do something. You guys all could go to your city council and whatever. It's not all on the police. Lexipol exists to fill a gap that we, the people, have left open. So I say don't demonize them for that. Certainly point out the faults and let's try to improve it. But at the end of the day, if we want a different system with more community input for these valid points of making sure that you don't create an absence of liability in government in a way that increases risk to the public. It's great to avoid liability, and that's a good thing because what you're doing is incorporating case law that controls government action. But there's different ways to protect liability. Things like body cameras, right? You could say, you will not have a body camera because we might be sued sometimes with that body camera footage. To which I say, good. If we hurt somebody and we owe money as compensation, that's the least we should do. We ought to write them a check and move on. But county council, who represents the government, wouldn't say the same thing. They'd say, wait a second, that's public money and we've got to carefully make sure we don't spend it all in one place. There's a tension there between those interests, and government and the public, through a variety of means, can and should step in to avoid Lexipol making tons of money off of what we ought to be doing ourselves. But until we do, more power to them for doing something.
And a quick last question. In that police departments are creatures of municipal government, not the federal government, do you think the Trump administration's reversal of Obama-era criminal justice reforms like redeploying the war on drugs is going to substantially affect local policing policies and practices? If so, how and what should be done? Again, quickly.
Man, we could just have had the whole panel about that. So quickly, Trump his policies have really set back criminal justice and police reform has significantly set it back. But not as, obviously under President Obama, one of the slides that Barry had was the 21st Century Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which I'm sure we use it as a guideline for what we're doing in LA. I'm sure you do it at the sheriff's office as well. Really, the biggest thing that the Justice Department under President Obama did very effectively, they used consent decrees and the threat of consent decrees to get local departments to start moving in the right direction. Sessions and Trump they've been they come from a totally different perspective. They've been very frank about saying we're not going to pursue any. They tried to undo the one in Baltimore. Fortunately, the judge did not continue to push it forward. But what you're seeing is local municipalities and states pick up the ball. So I'll just use Chicago and then I'll pass the mic. Chicago, for example, was ripe for a federal consent decree. After the election, that clearly wasn't going to happen. So what you see is the state is stepping in and they're formulating a consent decree. So I've been to Detroit, I've been to Chicago, I've spoken at length with folks in Seattle, because they're interested in what we're doing, because now they know they're not going to have the federal government helping them get their departments to where they need to be. So what you're seeing is more work that's being done at the local and state level.
Yeah, Matt's right. And in fact, it's happening in California also. So in San Francisco and in Sacramento, the state AG has been looking into the situations there. And San Francisco had been dealing with the US DOJ's COPS office until not only did they put an end to consent decrees, but also to collaborative reform, which is departments that wanted to work with some expertise at the national level to fix problems without there having to be litigation. I just think I would say this, and maybe it's a fine place to end, if ending is what we're doing, which is, there's a serious disagreement going on in this country right now about how to police. And though there's certainly no one right answer to that question, one approach said we just arrest as many people, we stop as many people, we frisk as many people as we can, and that's how we're going to drive down crime. And the other approach said you're alienating communities if you do that. If you want to have effective policing, you need communities involved. And the way to involve communities is to work with communities to fight crime. And the Trump White House and the Sessions DOJ has turned their back on that means of working collaboratively with communities and favored the first. And I think we're all going to pay a price for it.
I want to thank you all for joining in this discussion of how citizens Are you going to say anything? Okay. So I turn the mic over to our president.
Okay. Barry, I know you can't see me, so I'm going to say thank you very much.
I see you.
This was wonderful, and we've learned so much from all three of you. And the League of Women Voters is certainly interested in this topic, and will continue to have discourse and dialogue, and will even buy your book, Barry. If you would, if the two real people would come up to the, how do you say thank you to all three of you? Well, the way we seem to do it is maybe not the healthiest way, but it is saying that we think you're wonderful, and we hope that this little box of sweets will let you know how much we appreciate you. So thank you to each of you. And Barry, you get a virtual sweet. Thank you very much, all of you.